Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. Before we begin, this is an important message for all attendees. In order to hear interpreters in today's meeting, you must select your language preference. This includes those listening in English. Click on Interpretation in the meeting options and select English or Spanish. If you do not select a language preference, you will hear both English and Spanish. Again, click on Interpretation in the meeting options and select English or Spanish. We will begin today's meeting momentarily. My name is Ramona Khan, and I will be your moderator. Today, we will hear two formal presentations from the New York State Department of Labor. When your name is called, please unmute your computer and begin speaking. Before we begin, I have some important ground rules to share. You have been muted upon entry and will remain muted unless you have been called upon to speak. This will eliminate background noise. Please silence all electronic devices to avoid background noise or echoing. Any distracting video will be disabled. Presenters, if you would like to be recognized, please use the raise your hand feature in Zoom for us to acknowledge and call on you. Please note that today's meeting is being recorded. Finally, a reminder to please speak slowly so the interpreters have time to hear and interpret correctly what you're saying. At this time, I am pleased to welcome and introduce the Wage Board Chair, Brenda McDuffie, who will now start the meeting. Madam Chair, you may begin. Did you unmute?
It helps if you unmute. So thank you, Ms. Khan, again, and welcome to our Farm Laborers Wage Board meeting this evening. I am Brenda McDuffie, and I would again like to thank our Labor Commissioner, Commissioner Reardon, for the opportunity to serve as chair of the Farm Wage Board. Welcome to the members of the public who are in attendance this evening, and to tonight's presenters, Kevin Hannell and Jeanette Lizelle from the New York State Department of Labor. We're looking forward to your presentations. I would like to introduce my fellow board members representing the Farm Bureau. We have Mr. David Fisher, who's with us, and representing the New York State AFL-CIO, we have Mr. Dennis Hughes. Welcome. I'd also like to acknowledge our support team from the Department of Labor that are with us tonight. Mike Pagliano, Deputy Counsel to the Department of Labor, and Millen Blott, Deputy Commissioner for Worker Protection, for also being with us tonight, and for all the work they do as a great support team to the board. I look forward to continuing to work on this very, very important issue that's before us. I think I speak for all of the members of the board as well as the team that supports us to say that we will continue to work thoughtfully and diligently to fulfill our duties and responsibilities as members of the board. Before we move ahead with our agenda, I want to again remind our presenters of a couple of things for our meeting. We are conducting simultaneous translation during the meeting, so I would ask our presenters to please speak slowly to help our translators. And just so you know, this is not my regular speaking speed. So I'm hoping that it is slow enough for our translators, and I haven't gotten any signs otherwise. Today's meeting is open to the public, and it is being recorded. And for all of you who are here tonight, I just want to thank you, as we had technical difficulties at the beginning, and you were kind enough to be patient with us and to come back on to the hearings. The recordings and transcripts will be available on the Department of Labor's website, and that website is labor.ny.gov. If you can find more details, or if you want to find more details on the work of the Wage Board on the Department of Labor's website, it is there for you to review. The purpose of this meeting is for the Wage Board to receive presentations to inform our discussion about what we have learned from the 5 hearings, both oral and written testimonies. At this time, we are not receiving any further testimony from the public. The time for written submissions actually closed on October 31st. Transcripts and testimonies will be available soon in English and Spanish on the Department of Labor's website. The members of the board have each been provided copies with all written submissions for consideration. During this meeting, I may call for a short break if necessary. And with that, I would like to invite our first presenter, Jeanette Lizelle. Jeanette is the director of the Department of Labor's Division of Immigration Policies and Affairs. Jeanette will be providing a brief summary of the labor law changes that have occurred as a result of the Farm Laborers Fair Labor Practice Act, in particular, overtime. She will also give a brief overview of New York State Department of Labor's Worker Protection Division and Division of Immigration Policies and Affairs. Jeanette, you may begin. And thank you. You can unmute your line.
Thank you. I'm going to try to share my screen.
Thank you, Jeanette.
So I'm not able to share my screen. It says host disabled participation screen sharing.
Ramona, is it possible to give Jeanette the
Jeanette, you
ability to
should
share?
try. Yes, Jeanette, try again. I just give you some more options, so see if that works. Oops. Yes,
It's
I
going.
see. Yes,
Great.
we see it.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. So here's a brief summary of the Farm Labor Fair Labor Practices Act and recent updates in 2020. Farm laborers now earn overtime for hours worked over 60 in a calendar week. The following may be excluded: executive, professional, and administrative staff, and members of the employer's immediate family. Farm laborers are permitted to work voluntarily during their designated day of rest, provided the employer pays that day of work at the overtime rate. Employers must provide farm laborers at least one day of rest in every calendar week. The following may be excluded: executive, professional, and administrative staff, members of the employer's immediate family, and the foreman in charge. Employers, including farm labor contractors, must provide farm laborers with unemployment insurance coverage once the employer has paid wages of $300 or more to employees in a quarter. H-2A foreign guest workers are excluded from unemployment insurance coverage. The worker protection divisions within the New York State Department of Labor include the Division of Labor Standards, which enforces state labor laws, including farm labor and anti-retaliation regulations. The Division of Policies and Affairs was established in 2007 to address the growing need of immigrant and low-wage workers in the state. In 2012, the H-2A and H-2B visa application processing and agricultural outreach work was transitioned to DEPA. The Division of Immigrant Policies and Affairs, also known as DEPA, engages in education and compliance-based work. We are not law enforcement. That means that we do not issue notices of violations to employers for labor law violations. There are 6 programs implemented by DEPA, and the 2 connected to this industry are the Agriculture Labor Program, where staff perform outreach to farm workers around the state. In compliance with federal regulations, farm workers receive information about their labor law rights, employment services available, and assistance with complaints. The Foreign Labor Certification Unit process H-2A and H-2B job order applications for employers in New York State seeking foreign guest workers. This includes federally required housing inspections, field checks, and the referral of violations observed or discovered while in the field. Outreach staff are located throughout the state and work primarily in the field during the harvest season. Staff regularly partner with community organizations to provide educational outreach. Outreach staff also assist the Foreign Labor Certification Unit by conducting pre-occupancy housing inspections for 4 or less occupants, field checks, and field visits. When staff discover a possible violation in the field, they may attempt resolution with the employer or refer to the appropriate enforcement agency. How are violations handled by DEPA? DEPA staff receive information regarding possible violations of labor law. They will gather contact information and other details from affected workers. DEPA will then decide to either attempt education and compliance with the employer or refer to the appropriate enforcement agency. If DEPA's attempts at compliance are unsuccessful, the case is referred to enforcement. What happens if cases are referred to enforcement agencies? When cases are referred to enforcement agencies, DEPA will provide case information and may assist if necessary. The employer is subject to additional scrutiny by enforcement, including potential fines and penalties associated with the violations. If employers can correct violations, they should take the opportunity to do so. What are the types of violations DEPA routinely encounters in the field? Failure to post required posters, provide the required work agreement to workers, failure to provide compliant pay stubs to workers, failure to provide field sanitation and potable drinking water, unpaid wages for short periods of time and pay frequency violations, failure to pay New York State minimum wage after a recent increase, and failure to provide a meal period. Why is cooperating with DEPA a good idea? Being open to fixing little violations makes good business sense. Employers can be proactive in addressing little violations before they become too expensive to rectify. Employers may avoid liquidated penalties and fines that may be imposed by enforcement agencies. How has DEPA served agricultural employers and farm workers in 2020? We've conducted approximately 600 automated phone calls to farm workers, mailed out approximately 10,000 farm worker packets to farm workers in labor camps. DEPA's COVID-19 Spanish language commercial has been viewed over 5,500 times. DEPA's outreach commercial in English and Spanish has been shared through social media. DEPA has reviewed all COVID-19 complaints for the agriculture industry and followed up with employers to ensure they understand their health and safety obligations. And DEPA has communicated with all agricultural employers in New York State that have had COVID-19 positive farm workers to make sure that workers are receiving COVID-19 paid leave and are complying with Governor Cuomo's executive orders. From January 1st to October 29th, DEPA has received 28 complaints. 18 involved failure to pay wages, 7 involved work agreement violations, 9 involved minimum wage violations, 6 involved failure to pay overtime, and 4 involved failure to provide a day of rest. 13 of these complaints were referred to the Division of Labor Standards, and 12 were handled by DEPA. The remaining complaints are being processed. How will housing inspections for the H-2A guest worker program be conducted in 2021? How will this impact the migrant labor camp permit requirement under the FLFLPA? So the Department of Labor will conduct the housing inspection for housing of 4 or fewer workers for the purposes of the H-2A program. Employers will be able to bring in their H-2A workers while they work with the Department of Health to obtain their Part 15 labor camp permit. New York State Department of Labor virtual housing inspections for 4 or fewer workers will continue in most instances, but we will conduct in-person housing inspections for new farm worker housing to H-2A job orders. And well water testing conducted within 6 months of the start of that H-2A contract will still be required. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeanette, for that presentation, and Ramona for the signal for me to unmute myself. At this point in time, I know that we, as conducting this meeting, will only entertain questions from my colleagues, members of the Wage Board. And so I would like to ask David and Dennis, if you have any questions of Jeanette on her presentation. You have none. I see the heads going and the hands going, so to thank you. So for all the members of the public who are here tonight, please know that the specific information will be on the website. And I know there was a lot to digest because I was trying to digest it. And so, Jeanette, we will potentially come back to you individually to ask for clarifications of some of the information, but I thank you for your presentation. It really did give us a good overview of not only your work, but the work that's going on in New York State. Our final presenter for this evening is no stranger to us. Actually, Kevin Hanel has been with us, I believe, at every single hearing. And he is the chief of the Labor Statistics Bureau for the Department of Labor's Division of Research and Statistics. And he will be giving a presentation on the agriculture industry in New York State. Kevin?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am going to attempt to share my screen at this point, and we'll see how successful that is. Up. I'm also disabled from participant screen sharing, Ramona.
You should be able to try now, Kevin.
We're going to try it again.
There it is.
That looks good. All right. So I have a lot of information to share with us tonight, and I hope to go through it quickly, but still speak slowly enough for our translators. I'll start by quickly going through what I'll be talking about. I'll do a brief overview of the agricultural industry, both at the national level, and then delve a little bit more into the state. I'll talk about the impact of current events on the industry, what other states are doing about overtime for people in the agricultural industry, talk a little bit about our overtime law and some of the exceptions and exemptions we have, and then I'll discuss some similarly situated industries in New York State. So starting with that, our agricultural industry, starting at the national level, the agriculture industry, farms in the country contribute about 0.6% of GDP, $136.1 billion. But because they support a large number of other industries, food and related industries, as well as agricultural, contributed 1.109 trillion to the gross domestic product, about 5%, or 1 out of every $20 in the US is part of the farm related industries or farm supported. And it's not just the GDP, the dollars, the sales that contribute there. Employment, farms themselves support about 1.3% of the US employment, but with their contributing industries, it's up to 10.9% of the total US employment. And again, we're talking not just farming, and we're talking forestry and fishing, food and beverage and tobacco manufacturing, textile, leather manufacturing, food and beverage stores, and food service, eating and drinking places. Getting into New York State itself, New York State is a major agricultural state ranking in the top 10 in the country in the production of well over 30 commodities. I can't take credit for that. That comes from our New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets. And from a report that they provided, we're number 4 in dairy, providing 7% of the national total in dairy products. Number 2 in the country in apples, 12% of the national total. And I can go on and on. Number 2 in maple syrup, number 1 in yogurt, number 2 in cabbage, number 2 in snap peas. I'm going to talk a little bit about the information that we have already provided in some of these previous discussions, and that's also available on our website. The next 3 slides, I'll talk about industry composition, the geographies we use, and the data that we've been able to provide. But I'm not going to delve too much into that data itself because we've talked about it before and it is available online. So industry composition, I've mentioned this before. Our data is available to talk about 2, what they call NAICS code sectors. That stands for North American Industrial Classification System. There's crop production and animal production and aquaculture. Those are the 2 that we have information on and that I've provided information. I also will be providing, our reports provide information not just at the statewide level, but for our 10 labor market regions, and they're available on the screen. You can probably locate your own county somewhere on this map and know immediately which geographic region you're in. The data sources that we've used for our reports, there are 2. One is a quarterly census of employment and wages that we do here at the Department of Labor using some information provided through Tax and Finance. Our data here only includes places where they have workers covered by unemployment insurance. So much of the data that we provided, and I emphasize that, we're talking about employers and employees. Some small farms with just family members will not be included in this data. And I know that we're more concerned at this point in time about employed workers in these farms. So I'm hoping this will still be useful despite the fact we miss some farms who do not act as employers. The second set of data we use is called the American Community Survey data. It's conducted by the US Census Bureau, and they collect data over a period of time. We use data collected between 2014 and 2018, which is a wide period, but it gives us enough information to give us information about the workers in this industry. The information we provided previously comes from the briefing document on employment, wages, and hours that we have out on the website. The link is here, and you can find it if you go out to this link. It's in English and Spanish. I'm not going to go through the entire document. I will mention a couple things that it has in it. Based on that quarterly census of employment and wages data, this is where we get the number of 24,000 employees and about 2,000 establishments, wages of $842 million, which averages out to about $36,000 per employee. We do all 10 of the regions. We know that the Finger Lakes had the most agricultural establishment, and New York City had the fewest. We also note that most farms are small. And again, our data is collected on an annual basis, so there may be spikes in the numbers at certain times in the year that we don't capture too well because we then average it and annualize it. So if most of the time you have 5 workers on the farm, but at one point you need to double or triple that, on average, it will probably still be closer to 5 than it will be the higher number. The characteristics that we get from the census data indicate that the agricultural workers are younger than the average worker in all private industry, and the number of males far outweigh the number of females. There's more information out there, again, in the report. The major thing that we did notice is that agricultural employees tend to work longer hours compared to the average worker in all other private industries, especially working more than 41 hours and up to 51, more than 60 hours a week. More than 60 hours a week is 5 times that, the share is 5 times that of most private sector workers. The other information we get from the census data is that these 2 sub-industries, crop production and animal production, rank among New York's top 10 industries working 60 hours or more per week between 2014 and 18. I'd like to talk a little bit about current events at this time. We have some trends going on here, including trends towards automation in the industry. An example would be in dairy farming, which is New York State's largest sub-industry. It's becoming increasingly automated with the use of robots. There's been some studies academic studies that estimate that robots can cut the number of workers on a dairy farm by 50%. But those same studies mention that it's an expensive upgrade and can cost quite a bit of money to do so. In general, there's been other trends in automation in farmers. A recent USDA blog post talked about how research at land-grant universities are working together to develop automated systems that work well for labor-intensive specialty crops. They also mentioned in the same blog post that automation is helping the specialty crop industry overcome labor shortages, fine-tune management decisions, conserve resources, and meet growing demand. So it sounds fairly optimistic. We didn't delve too deeply into the automation, but there is more information available. One source that I might want to draw your attention to is there is a journal article called A Comprehensive Review on Automation in Agriculture using Artificial Intelligence from the journal Artificial Intelligence in Agriculture, their June 2019 issue. Other trends, impacts, or current events going on, I have to talk about COVID. The COVID pandemic not only triggered a new type of crisis for the farming sector, it came at a pretty tough time in some ways. The past few years, global commodity production has outpaced demand in most years, and prices have been falling. For example, between 2012 and 2019, producer prices for corn fell 48%, prices for soybeans fell 40%, and prices for others, cattle, hogs, broilers, milk, have also been on downward trends these last 5 years. And while the prices that the farmers have been getting for their products have been dropping, the cost of production has either been staying steady or maybe even slightly rising a little bit, which is definitely pinching things in the last few years. And then COVID hits. It exacerbated the challenges facing these farmers. The rapid proliferation of COVID-19 at home and abroad, subsequent shutdowns of part of the economy, led to unprecedented and simultaneous supply and demand shocks to the food system. There's consequences. There was decreases in demand for biofuels. There was a shift in where people ate. Some people used to eat fairly often in restaurants and found themselves eating at home. The restaurants were closed for a while. Schools were closed for a while, and a lot of farms were set up to supply not to supermarkets, not to the general public, but had their supply lines designed to ship towards restaurants, big buyers, school systems, and shifting that was very, very difficult for some people. They had to grapple with the falling prices. They had to, in some cases, the extra output that they could not get rid of through their normal supply lines led them to euthanize livestock, dump milk, and dispose of perishable products that could not be stored. And they lost jobs. Unemployment rose in rural areas. Talk a little bit about the dairy industry, again, because it's very important in New York State. Milk prices seem to be below the cost of production. They're dumping the milk. And as I mentioned before, they supplied a lot of places away from home. Industry estimates suggest that 50 to 6% of cheese and perhaps half of the butter were consumed away from home prior to pandemic. And it's not easy to switch and start selling those in a supermarket. So as I mentioned, the disruptions affected farmers early. Some farmers were not ready to make the shift from supplying restaurants to supplying grocers and other retailers. And some lack the knowledge of even how to get hold of those supply chains and distribution channels in a different industry. Some farmers had to sell their products directly to consumers, for example, in a farmer's market, or else to streamline the supply chain to get their products to grocery stores that needed them the most. Out in Long Island, for example, many farms have been impacted by the closure of restaurants and the slowdown in that. On the other hand, others have been doing well with the influx of people from the city moving to the East End full-time and driving out for day trips, farm stands, consumer agricultural boxes. Those things have been doing better during this time period. How has employment in the industry been affected by COVID? As every other industry, claims are up. Putting in for unemployment claims over the year from this year compared to last year, they're up 273%. I will note that is less than the average rise in the state and less than accommodation and food services, which has been affected by the farm issues. So some of the issues that farmers are facing right now, we see because of these current events, is there's some labor shortages, farms with permanent year-round employees. We're already faced with worker shortages, or we're faced with worker shortages due to the COVID-19 outbreaks among employees. And many farms are operating shorthanded. The New York State Farm Bureau did a survey in July, in the middle of crisis, showing that 65% of the New York State farms report negative outcomes due to COVID. 43% lost sales, 37% had cash flow issues, 19% lost restaurant sales, transportation issues, labor issues. Though the survey I'll mention did say that 8% of the people reporting said they had some positive information, usually going from increased sales in their farms, farmers markets, or places close to them. Now I'd like to get in and talk about 5 other states that have dealt with the overtime issue. The other states have varying levels of overtime protection for their agricultural workers, starting with Hawaii. It has a very, very small agricultural sector. Their rule is there's overtime after 40 hours per week, but employers can select up to 20 weeks per year where the threshold is 48 hours, allowing them to kind of take some of the pressure off their crunch period. Maryland allows overtime after 60 hours per week. Minnesota insists on overtime pay after 48 hours per week. In California, it's a little complicated. I'll talk about that a little bit more, and then I'll talk about Washington State, who did things a little bit differently. So these different states here, by the way, if you look, they have varying sizes of their agricultural industry. Minnesota is probably the closest match to New York State in the number of employers and employees and the payrolls in this area. California is very, very big. Maryland and Hawaii, much smaller than us. California went in with a phased-in approach to their overtime. The agricultural workers will eventually reach overtime pay on the same basis as workers in most other industries. They started back in 2016, slowly reducing by a little bit. I think at one point they were dropping for about 5 hours every year. They would reduce the cutoff until they reached the 40-hour standard. And they would also, on the same basis, the daily cutoff before overtime pay would kick in was dropping by about half an hour a day. In the end, as they gradually reduced both the hours per day and the hours per week, which would trigger that overtime, for different employers, small firms had different cutoffs and different dates when that would drop. But by January 1st, 2022, for larger employers, and by January 1st, 2025, for smaller employers, they will be at their standard California rate of overtime after 8 hours a day or 40 hours a week. Also, at the same time, California added some other protections besides overtime pay for those agricultural workers. They're entitled to all statutory protections in working hours and overtime requirements from which they were previously excluded, with the exception of the phased-in cutoffs for the overtime. And they were now required to give employees 1 day of rest in 7. State of Washington is an interesting case. They did not move legislatively to change the laws there. However, just a few weeks ago, the Washington Supreme Court ruled that the state's dairy workers are entitled to overtime pay if they work more than 40 hours a week, based on their reading of the state constitution. The decision is expected to apply to the rest of the agricultural industry the way it was decided. The reasoning of the courts And that decision makes Washington the first state to grant farm workers overtime protections through the courts. The reasoning of the courts is that farm work is considered very dangerous work, and according to their state laws, dangerous work requires overtime protections. The last thing I'd like to share with the board is the New York State overtime law and some of the exceptions that we have in existence now. Some of this may be information you're already familiar with, but I'm going to go through it anyways. Under both federal and New York law, employers must pay non-exempt employees at least the minimum wage for each hour worked and 1.5 times their regular rate of pay whenever they work more than 40 hours in a work week. That's the standard. There is a few small little caveats here. Residential employees, which are employees that live in the residence of their employer, they have a different weekly cutoff of about 44 hours. And employees covered by state law, but not federal law for overtime, will have a slightly different rate of overtime pay. It's based on 1.5 times the minimum rate of pay. Very, very few employees get covered by this protection. There's only one industry excluded from overtime law, and that's government. Though some of our nonprofit sector, new ones just starting up, may apply for a temporary, I believe, 6-month exception, either when they're incorporated or after they hire their first employee. And then the other caveat is there are some jobs, some work that is exempt from the overtime law. Jobs exempt from the overtime law. They're not industries. This is work that's exempt from the overtime pay in New York. The 4 main exemption categories are executive, administrative, professional, outside sales. These are jobs usually that have higher levels of pay in many cases. They have some autonomy. They have some decision-making powers. Other than those, we have a few exceptions scattered about, and I have a list of them down there. Part-time babysitters, for example, members of religious orders. The jobs in the agriculture industry, for the most part, don't fit too well with any of those exceptions. These are the top 5 occupations, according to the National Staffing Patterns for Agriculture. And a lot of these, this covers about 80% of the workforce in these 5 occupations. So let's take a look and see how similarly situated industries in New York State deal with the overtime issue. We looked at a number of things that we would say that other industries have to deal with as well. For example, no other industry is exactly like another, but there are other industries that have to deal with dependency on the weather being good, seasonality, and the fact that they're only available to produce goods at a certain time. They may require surge staffing. For example, at harvest time, agriculture faces that, but other industries may too. Other industries have to work with living animals, which require special consideration. And other industries may suffer from a lack of an immediate workforce nearby. We took a look at a few of those. Transportation and warehousing, for example, deals all the time with surge prices, especially around the holiday crunch time. I cannot imagine what the delivery drivers are thinking those 5-6 days before Christmas, but the industry deals with that all the time. And again, 40 hours, 1.5 times pay after 40 hours for that industry. Retail trade, same issue, the surges during the holiday crunch time. the same deal with the 40 hours, 1.5 times afterwards. A lot of the occupations also in retail trade are also lower paying occupations. So they are definitely not too many of the staff in those would qualify for any of the occupational exceptions. Golf courses operate all the time according to weather, seasonality. They have surges depending on certain things happening. They follow the trend of agricultural very, very well in the sense that, at least for growing crops, crop production, they match the seasonality. They follow the 40 hours, 1.5 times rule. Landscaping, and also in the landscaping industry, on the opposite side, we have snow plowing. Both landscaping and snow plowing are weather dependent. There's some seasonality issues. There are surge issues in the sense that when a storm hits, they need to get the plows out and perhaps they may be working for very long hours. This industry also deals with the 40 hours, 1.5 pay. Construction, weather dependency, seasonality. The largest occupation in construction is just laborers, people that work on the different projects. They're not specialized yet in plumbing or electricity or as electricians or carpenters, but construction laborers are out there working. And in many cases, construction laborers or any construction occupation, no matter how well paid, will not qualify for the occupational exemptions. They go with the 40 hours and 1.5 times pay. Hotels deal with some seasonality issues. They have some surging issues. They go with the standard rules for overtime. Recreational and vacation camps. These are establishments primarily engaged in overnight recreational camps, some children's camps, some vacation camps, etc. Similar to agriculture, they do suffer from issues with seasonality, and a lot of times they are situated far away from a large workforce, so they bring in workers from a distance. They also include, they employ camp counselors. That is one of the exceptions to the overtime rules. For a variety of reasons, the counselors there are often on the campsite 24 hours, including when they're sleeping, eating, even their off time. The overtime rules do not apply to that occupation in this industry. Now, as for dealing with live animals, we have a few industries that have to work around animals, their lives, and the issues with keeping caretakers available at all times. Zoos are one very interesting industry. Animal caretakers are very common there. They follow the standard overtime rules, 40 hours, 1.5 times pay. Pet care, kennels, anybody who's taking care of or boarding animals, same situation there. The animal caretakers are the largest occupation in this industry as well, and they follow the standard overtime rules of 40 hours, 1.5 pay. And the last industry I want to talk about is another one that deals a lot with animals, veterinarian services. A lot of times your pet, your horse, whatever it is, has to be kept on site. They have to have technicians, caretakers, other staff available at all times. And they also follow the standard overtime rules of 40 hours, 1.5 times pay. I provided quite a bit of information there. I hope that this was useful and I did not bore everybody to sleep.
Thank you, Kevin. I think you said it well. There's a lot of information here, and it was very enlightening and reinforcing. So again, I thank both you and Jeanette for being with us tonight. And I'd like to ask my fellow board members if they have any questions of you.
No, but thank you. Did you hear me?
Thank you, Dennis. Yes, thank you, Dennis.
Yeah,
David, you muted yourself.
sorry.
Okay, you're good.
You talked about GDP, but it's 5%. And I guess one question and then another, and two questions to that. One is, I don't believe it showed anything pre-farm. So I think the GDP of the farm community is much bigger than that. If you look at all the products we buy and utilize, was that in that number?
The GDP, I got those numbers from national site, the USDA, and those are the numbers they were placing up there for what they were talking about for farms on a national level. So I don't know exactly what they include in their GDP analysis, but if it's the USDA, it would be a standard definition that would be applied to most industries. I can look and see if you'd like and get more information on that for you.
I was just curious. And then I think we need, is there anything on, especially in California where you referenced their rules, but you didn't go into anything on history or trends or anything like that and farm profitability, since these things have ratcheted down? I think that would be interesting to look at those numbers and what crops they're growing and what crops they've cut back on and acreages that have cut back, or maybe Ag and Markets can look into that or something.
I can see if I can get you some information on the number of businesses, employers in that, and if there's been any trend in the last 5 years.
Your comment about robots and reducing, that's going to be really slow to come. And the dairy farmers I've spoken to have not seen significant reductions as much as what you would think. So I think it can come, but I don't think it's a long ways from here yet. I think we need to talk about similar industries, because I don't really think any of those are similar industries. There's none of those that deal with the combination of weather and biological systems that we all deal with, whether it be having crops in the field and weather patterns coming that you just can't stop, you've got to keep going, or dealing with animals. I guess I would say the only one that was similar would be your camp counselor comparison, which is exempt because we are on call 24/7 to take care of these animals. And then, a lot of our fruits and vegetables, timing is so crucial in harvest. You can have a nice summer squash this morning, and if you don't get it picked today, by tonight, it's gone by, it's waste. And as fussy as the marketing people are, it's not any good. The other thing, a lot of those industries are price setters, not price takers like we are. So just quite a few different things. I just don't think people realize what we deal with in growing fruits, vegetables, even corn and soybean commodities like that, and the hours we have to work within the short time windows. And it's just highly different than even California, where there's big open flat fields that they can better utilize mechanization out there than we can. And it's an arid climate, so they don't have to worry about the weather and all that. So I guess I just had to say that. So. Is Ag and Markets going to do something similar to this or anything, or do we know?
As you know, they were anticipated to come tonight, and Kevin did cover significant part of his information was related to some of those things that they would bring forward. They have been invited, and so we would hopefully be able to hear directly from them. But I also want to say, David, thank you for your questions, comments, because as you know, as we deliberate, we want to take all of that into consideration, using a base of information that differentiates maybe New York State from other places. So thank you. Any other questions? I was curious also, like David, about California. You talked about their phased in reduction and over a period of time. And I really like to hear a little bit more about that and what percentage of their economy is agricultural based, versus what we have in New York. Very different in terms of climate and topography, but would like to hear that and the impact, with this phase in that it had on the industry.
Be glad to get the board that information.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
No,
No. David, you're
No.
okay? Okay. Well, again, that concludes our hearings for tonight. And I again want to thank Kevin and Jeanette for being here, as well as all of you who have participated with us. I'd like to remind you that all materials related to today's event will be posted on the New York State Department of Labor's website. And that website is labor.ny.gov. Our next public meeting that we will hold as a board will take place on December 1st, and that will be at 4 p.m. And that information will be posted, as well as the link, on the Department of Labor's website. I'd like to again thank you all for attending tonight's meeting. And, given the situation that we're all facing across the country, but in our state with COVID, I would just ask that each and every one of you please be safe. We're coming upon Thanksgiving next week, and we have much to be thankful for. And so I look forward to seeing you in December, and I would ask that you please stay safe and well. Thank you for being with us this evening.
thank you.